Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Vuhledar, where we see that the Russians have started the second battle of the city. The Russians have initiated this battle from a long-term strategy where they were moving towards the road connected between Vuhledar and Konstantinivka. Over a long period of many months, since the beginning of the Battle of Avdiivka, the Russians have moved in the direction of Novomikhailivka to gain control over the town, then on to Pereskoivka and on to Konstantinivka in the north. Along the road between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar, the Russians have done a similar thing where they continuously kept pushing along the southern flank to start gaining control over further parts of the area before finally gaining control over the entirety of the road between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar all the way to the coal mine just northeast of Vuhledar. This has significantly strengthened the Russian position in the area and has limited the supplies of the Ukrainians. With Russians gain control over the coal mine, the Ukrainians will be left with just a single supply line in and out of Vuhledar, which will be under direct fire control of the Russians. We see that the Russians would then be completely physically cutting off the supply road here to the east, which would leave only this one to the north under Ukrainian control. And as we can see, it is within a close proximity of the coal mine, which means that if the Russians gain control of it, the Ukrainians would be under their fire control when moving in and out of Vuhledar here from the northern direction. In the southern direction, there is this road that is so close to Pavlivka that the Russians will also have fire control of it, and at the same time it is connected here to the south of Vuhledar. So in reality there are two supply lines, but both would be in extreme close proximity to the Russian positions where they would have fire control of it. The Ukrainians would here have both connections in the direction of Vuhledar. At the same time, we see that the Russians are now within close proximity of Vuhledar and have control over the fortified positions in the area. This means that they could launch an offensive operation towards Vuhledar and use that as a springboard to physically cut off the road to the north of Vuhledar, leaving only a singular road which is in close proximity to Pavlivka under Ukrainian control to resupply through Vuhledar. And if the Russians manage to cut off physically the road here north of Vuhledar, they'll be looking to push further westwards to gain control of the fortified positions south of Vuhledar. However, this is a risky mission because the Ukrainians would be able to launch a counterattack to flank the Russian positions north of it. Therefore, it is likely that the Russians will not just keep it at this part, and we see evidence of this with the recent Russian advance and storming of Prechestivka, which is about 20 square kilometers of gained territory here to the south of the town, as the Russians launched an assault from the highway from Pavlivka towards Prechestivka and from the south. This has allowed the Russians to reach the outskirts of the town, and with heavy bombardments, there are mixed reports about the success of the Russians, but if the Russians look to gain control over Prechestivka, they'll be able to develop further offensive operations in the north towards Novokranka and to the west towards the Solotaniva, where they can do a similar tactic from the south and the east at the same time. This will allow the Russians to launch two offensive operations at the same time, on the northern flank of Vuhledar and on the western flank of Vuhledar, where the Russians would be looking to cut off the roads between Vuhledar and Vuhledar, and at the same time launch a secondary offensive towards the west through Prechestivka, Novokranka, and then finally Vuhledar. This is to mitigate the risk with an offensive operations to the east, as it will allow the Russians to take advantage of a Ukrainian potential counterattack, where the Ukrainians would need to concentrate their forces here in the north to then launch a counterattack or within Vuhledar. This would use up their forces, weakening their western flank, which will allow the Russians to flank a potential Ukrainian counterattack. So this assault here to the west is not directly related to the capture of Vuhledar, but indirectly related in the sense that it spreads out the Ukrainian forces and defense of the city. Based on this, we see that it is clear that the Russians are looking to gain full control over Vuhledar with this offensive, and their primary target is the defensive positions northeast and west of the city, as well as the supply lines going in and out of it. The Russians now have fire control over one of them, leaving 2 others here in the north, close to the front line but outside of Russian fire control. Therefore, the fighting here by the coal mine, which was geolocated, is an extremely important battle, as if the Russians gain control of it, it would completely limit the supply of the Ukrainians significantly to the point at which they would suffer greatly. And it would spell the end of the Ukrainian hold on the city here near the front line, which has held for the entirety of the war. The reason for this is if the Ukrainians have such limited supplies, they would eventually, under a long term, be forced to withdraw from the city. If instead the Russians use this opportunity that they have created through prioritizing the Donetsk region over the Kursk region, it allows them to take advantage of the situation to develop offensive operations, which they are actively doing. We see that both in the direction of Vuhledar now, as well as the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Donetsk section of the front line, and the Chasiv Yar direction, as well as several fighting taking place in the Kupiansk direction and Siversk direction. The entirety of the Donetsk region is under constant Russian attacks, as well as some positional fighting in the Kupiansk direction and Siversk direction. We see in the direction of Donetsk, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the eastern parts of the Rurikon here to the south of the prison area, where heavy fighting is taking place over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians, which will, if the Russians gain control of it, allow them to start the real offensive assault of Donetsk city itself, as it will connect both the southern and northern flank and allow the Russians to have a foothold across the entirety of the eastern parts of the city, and allow the Russians to gather enough forces near the second line of defense to start a proper offensive within the city. This will lead to a very long battle over the city itself, which is heavily fortified. If the Ukrainians decide to fight for it, it will drain a lot of the resources from both sides. This means that the Russians in the Pokrovsk direction would not expect too much Ukrainian reinforcements arriving to the section of the front line, as they would be busy elsewhere. If they instead focus on the Pokrovsk section or the Vuhledar section, then the other parts will see more success. The Ukrainians simply do not have enough units to defend everything. And this is also shown with the Russian capture of Vyemka, which took place as the Russians now have control over that village as well. The Russians are slowly developing offensive operations in the Siversk direction with the control over Vesele, Rusalivka, Spirne, Ivanodarivka, and Vyemka. The Russians have gained control over 5 villages which had not been touched since the fall of Lysychansk in the summer of 22. So why are the Russians advancing this much in the east? Well, it is shown with the recent Ukrainian advance in the Kursk section of the front line, and that is that the Ukrainians are doubling down with their Kursk offensive. We see that with this series of captures of villages here in the northern parts of the Kursk region, and this is due to the fact that the Ukrainians a couple of weeks ago, as I mentioned in a video, started a second wave of their Kursk offensive. This advance is not one that happened in a single day, but instead it is the result of the past 2 weeks of fighting. We've seen that the Ukrainians, as soon as I mentioned this second wave of fighting, they started pushing in every direction from the Sucha direction, where they didn't find any success in the Martinovka and eastern section. This was because the Russians were constantly uploading videos of heavy fighting taking place in these directions, where they were able to repel these fights. Instead, we did not see many of these videos in the north, and this is likely due to the Ukrainian success. As the Ukrainians are in a offensive operation, it is not very smart to announce your positions. The Ukrainians are in a operational security phase where they do not really post anything that happens in the Kursk direction until weeks after it has happened, and this is why we get this information this late. The Ukrainians continue their Kursk offensive with their objective being to expand and gain control over as much as possible and force the Russians to withdraw units from the east and south to the Kursk direction. This is why the siege of the same river area continues. The Russians are constantly under heavy pressure in the Koronevo direction and eastern directions. The Ukrainians ended up being pushed back from Borki, and then following additional assaults, they managed to recapture it. And this again shows this is the second wave. Their first wave was pushed back and they were losing their initiative. So the Ukrainians sent in a second wave to regain the initiative, which they have. And this second wave has been successful in regaining the initiative, which has led to new advances by the Ukrainians. So we see that the Ukrainians are committing and doubling down to the Kursk offensive despite the Russians similarly doubling down and expanding their offensive operations in the east and south. Based on this, we see that the game of chicken between the Ukrainian and Russian army has raised its stakes, as whoever comes out on top and is the last to chicken out, as they say, will be the one to gain the most from the current situation. If the Ukrainians now fall back and stop the Kursk offensive, then all their losses would be for nothing, and they would be in a situation where the morale of the Ukrainian army would simply plummet because they gave up a lot of important fortified positions in the east to launch this Kursk offensive, to simply use up that much armored vehicles, elite units, and equipment that could have been used in the east to then just withdraw and cancel the operation would be a massive hit to the morale. And similarly, if the Russians stop their offensive operations in the east, they would also be giving up a lot of positions and slow down their advances, which could end up gaining and giving a good advantage to Ukrainians in their defensive positions, as would allow the Ukrainians to reestablish their positions, potentially counterattack to regain some positions, and strengthen their areas, which would prolong the war. Based on that, it is clear that whoever is the last to chicken out, whoever is the last to withdraw, is the one that wins. And this is why both sides are doubling down, because if they raise the stakes, then it is more likely that one of them will chicken out and fall back. And this is why we're seeing that the situation is becoming worse for the defender on both sides, both in the north and in the south, as well as the east. As more units are being introduced, stronger units are being introduced, more weapons and equipment is being introduced, which speeds up the advances and increases the risk. This means that the pace of advances in the month of August will likely be overturned by the month of September. The month of September may be even more than the month of August due to how heavy the fighting is. There simply is too many units involved in the fighting for the front lines to be stable on either side. If the Russians relocate some troops to the north, they would weaken the offensive in the east and it would slow down. But instead, they have strengthened their positions in the east instead of prioritizing the Kursk direction, which has led to the Russian offensive in the east speeding up and allowing them to expand the front line. And this has led to the Ukrainians, when they strengthen their positions in the Kursk region instead of the east, to weaken their defensive positions in the east and instead strengthen their offensive operations in the Kursk direction, leading to further advances. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.